There is a quiet, rhythmic pulse that has dictated the rise and fall of every civilization in human history, a heartbeat of credit and obligation that remains invisible until the moment it stops. We often view history as a series of chaotic accidents, wars, revolutions, and the whims of madmen. But beneath the surface of the grandest triumphs and most harrowing tragedies lies a mathematical inevitability known as the long-term debt cycle. This cycle, which spans roughly 75 to 100 years, represents the total duration of a society's willingness and ability to borrow against its future. It begins with the birth of a new world order, defined by low debt and high productivity. But it ends with a supercycle collapse. A point where the mountain of accumulated interest becomes so heavy that the underlying economy can no longer support its own weight. Today, every metric available to global financial institutions suggests that we are not merely in a recession or a temporary downturn, but in the final volatile act of a century-long supercycle that began in the wreckage of 1945. The stakes of this transition cannot be overstated because a debt supercycle does not end with a simple market correction. It ends with a fundamental restructuring of how money, power, and sovereignty are defined. When a nation's debt grows faster than its income for decades, it eventually hits a hard limit where interest rates can no longer be lowered to stimulate growth, and the printing of new currency becomes the only tool left to prevent a total systemic freeze. This is the stage where the hidden mechanics of central banking are forced into the light, revealing a precarious architecture that relies entirely on the collective belief that tomorrow, S growth will pay for yesterday, S excess. As the gap between what is owed and what is actually produced reaches a breaking point, history shows us that the resolution is almost always violent, involving the mass destruction of wealth, the collapse of reserve currencies, and a radical shift in the global hierarchy. To understand why the current global financial system feels increasingly fragile, one must look past the daily news cycle and examine the recurring patterns of the last 500 years. To truly grasp the gravity of our current position, we must rewind to the era of the Roman Empire, which provides the earliest and most complete blueprint for the death of a debt supercycle. By the 3rd century AD, Rome had reached the limits of its expansion. The costs of maintaining a sprawling military, a massive bureaucracy, and a social welfare system known as bread and circuses had far outpaced the empire, whereas tax revenues. Instead of cutting spending, a move that would have invited immediate political insurrection, the Roman emperors turned to the only tool available, the debasement of their currency, the silver denarius. Under Emperor Septimius Severus, the silver content of the coin was reduced to roughly 50%, but by the reign of Gallienus, it contained less than 5% silver. This was the ancient equivalent of quantitative easing, an attempt to pay off massive debts with currency that was increasingly worthless. The result was a feedback loop of hyperinflation and societal fragmentation, where the middle class was wiped out, trade networks collapsed into localized bartering, and the empire transitioned from a prosperous, interconnected trade zone into a dark age of feudalism and survival. The pattern repeated with startling precision during the 18th century in France, under the direction of a Scottish gambler turned economist named John Law. Following the ruinous wars of Louis XIV, France was drowning in debt that it could never hope to repay through taxation. Law's solution was the Mississippi Scheme, a plan to consolidate the national debt into a massive joint stock company, and issue paper banknotes backed by the limitless wealth of the Louisiana Territory. For 3 years, France experienced an unprecedented economic boom. The word millionaire was coined to describe the newly rich speculators in Paris. However, the system was built on a foundation of unpayable debt and artificial liquidity. When the public realized that the paper notes in their hands far exceeded the actual gold and silver in the royal vaults, the supercycle of that era ended in a total panic. The French economy was paralyzed for decades, creating the deep-seated social resentment and fiscal instability that would eventually culminate in the French Revolution, proving that when the financial engine of a nation breaks, the political structure is never far behind. The most critical parallel to our modern era, however, is found in the period between 1914 and 1945. This was the conclusion of the British Empire's debt supercycle, a transition that saw the global reserve currency status pass from the pound sterling to the US dollar. Before World War I, Britain was the world's undisputed financial superpower. But the staggering costs of total war forced the empire to borrow heavily from its own colonies and, more importantly, from the United States. By the 1920s, the global financial system was a house of cards. Germany owed reparations to France and Britain, who in turn owed war debts to the US. This supercycle reached its terminal phase in 1929, leading to the Great Depression, a period of massive debt deleveraging where the world was forced to choose between mass defaults or mass money printing. The failure to resolve these debts peacefully led directly to the rise of populist movements and eventually the Second World War. It was only after the total destruction of the old order that the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement could establish a new cycle, anchored by a gold-backed dollar. Understanding these historical collapses requires a deep dive into the specific mechanism that makes a supercycle different from a normal business cycle. In a standard 8 to 10-year cycle, debt is used to finance productive investments, and when it becomes too high, a short recession forces bad debt to be cleared through bankruptcies. However, for the last 80 years, central banks have consistently stepped in to prevent these healthy corrections. Every time the economy began to stumble, in 1987, 2000, 2008, and 2020, policymakers lowered interest rates and injected liquidity to keep the system afloat. While this prevented short-term pain, it also prevented the clearing of debt, allowing it to accumulate to levels that are now mathematically impossible to repay under traditional economic growth models. We have replaced clearing the debt with refinancing the debt, effectively kicking the can down the road until we have reached the end of the road itself. Today, global debt to GDP ratios have surpassed 300%, a level that has historically preceded every major currency collapse in history. This mechanism creates a phenomenon known as the liquidity trap, where interest rates are stuck at or near zero because even a small increase in the cost of borrowing would trigger a wave of defaults across the entire global economy. When governments, corporations, and households are all leveraged to the hilt, the central bank loses its primary tool for controlling inflation. If they raise rates to stop prices from rising, they crash the bond market and bankrupt the government. If they keep rates low to save the banks, they destroy the value of the currency. This is the climax of the debt supercycle, a point of no return where there are no good options left. Only a choice between a deflationary depression, mass defaults, or an inflationary depression, printing the debt away. As we look at the current geopolitical landscape, it becomes clear that the major powers are already positioning themselves for this inevitable reset. The aggressive move toward de-dollarization by the BRICS nations and the sudden massive accumulation of gold by central banks are not random events. They are the defensive maneuvers of institutions that know the current cycle is in its final hours. This brings us to the acceleration phase, a period characterized by a frantic final expansion of credit that feels like prosperity, but is actually the systemic equivalent of a death rattle. In the decade following the 2008 global financial crisis, the world did not deleverage. Instead, it embarked on the largest debt binge in the history of the human race. According to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the Institute of International Finance, IIF, global debt surged past $320 trillion by 2024, roughly 330% of the entire world over annual economic output. To visualize the speed of this acceleration, consider that it took centuries for global debt to reach its first $100 trillion, but less than 2 decades to triple that figure. This explosion is driven by a structural shift where governments have taken the private debts of banks and corporations onto their own balance sheets. This process, known as sovereign absorption, changes the nature of the risk. When a bank fails, it is a localized crisis. When a sovereign government's debt becomes unsustainable, it is a regime-ending event. We are currently seeing the interest rate growth differential turn predatory. For decades, as noted by economists like Kenneth Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart, governments could outrun their debt because interest rates were lower than economic growth. But as the supercycle reaches its zenith, that gap closes. Today, the United States spends more on interest payments for its debt than it does on its entire national defense budget. This is the mathematical threshold where a state ceases to be a provider of security and starts to become a mere clearinghouse for its creditors. Beneath the surface of this debt mountain, hidden forces and power structures are already re-architecting the global hierarchy. The Bank for International Settlements, BIS, has frequently warned of shadow banking and off-balance sheet liabilities, estimated at over $80 trillion in missing, debt tied to foreign exchange swaps and derivatives. These are the hidden gears of the supercycle. Unlike the transparent debt of the 19th century, modern debt is digitized, leveraged, and interconnected through high-frequency trading and algorithmic risk management. This means that when the collapse begins, it will move at the speed of fiber optic cables. We are seeing a monetary power struggle where the core central banks, the Fed, the ECB, and the BOJ are attempting to coordinate a soft reset to prevent a disorganized crash. Yet, the incentive structures have diverged. Emerging powers, led by China and the BRICS bloc, are no longer willing to subsidize the West's debt by holding trillions in depreciating paper assets. Their shift toward hard assets like gold and strategic commodities is a signal that the trust required to maintain the current debt cycle has evaporated. The climax and revelation of this story is a truth that is rarely discussed in mainstream financial commentary. Debt is not a resource, it is a claim on future labor and energy. When a debt supercycle collapses, It is because the world has realized that the collective claims on the future, the debt, far exceed the world asmeia's physical ability to deliver that future. We have pre-consumed the next 20 years of global productivity. The coming great deleveraging will not be a typical recession. It will be a period of wealth realignment. In previous supercycle ends, this realignment occurred through three specific avenues: hyperinflation, destroying the value of the debt; mass default, destroying the value of the assets; or war, resetting the geopolitical ledger. History teaches us that the transition is never a single day of chaos, but a season of darkness. A multi-year process where the old rules of money are rewritten in real time. We are currently in the final quiet period of this transition, where the metrics of 1929 and the Roman debasement are aligning with the digital reality of the 21st century. The pattern is finished. The cycle is complete. As the cycle reaches its final phase, the social and political fabric of the nation begins to tear. This is not a coincidence, but a documented symptom of the debt supercycle's conclusion. When a society can no longer grow its way out of debt, it turns inward, looking for someone to blame for the vanishing prosperity. Historically, this is the era of the internal conflict stage, a period marked by wealth gaps so extreme that they mirror the conditions of 1920s America or pre-revolutionary France. According to data from the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, when total non-financial debt crosses the 300% of GDP threshold, the productivity of each new dollar of debt collapses. In the 1950s, a single dollar of new debt generated roughly 80 cents of GDP growth. Today, that same dollar produces less than 20 cents. The rest is simply consumed by the ghost of interest, the mandatory payments required to keep the system from seizing. This brings us to the institutional response, the managed reset. Behind the closed doors of the IMF and the world's leading central banks, there's an unspoken recognition that the debt can never be repaid in current nominal terms. The strategy, therefore, shifts from payment to repression. Financial repression is a term used by economists like Carmen Reinhart to describe a set of policies where governments keep interest rates below the rate of inflation for a decade or more. This effectively taxes the saver to subsidize the debtor. It is a slow-motion liquidation of the middle class, a quiet wealth transfer designed to melt away the real value of the debt without a localized event that could spark a revolution. However, history shows that this is a dangerous game. In the 1930s, as countries abandoned the gold standard and engaged in competitive devaluations, they inadvertently destroyed the trade-enhancing benefits of a global monetary standard. Today, a shift toward central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, and unified ledgers is the modern version of this, an attempt to build a new plumbing system for money before the old one completely rusts away. The ending of a debt supercycle is rarely the end of the world, but it is always the end of a specific world order. The 1873 railroad crisis ended the era of unfettered industrial expansion and led to a 20-year-long depression. The 1929 crash ended the British-led financial era and paved the way for the American century. Each time, those who understood the pattern, who saw that debt is merely a temporary claim on energy, were the ones who survived the transition. We are moving into a period where paper claims will be tested against physical reality. The question for the observer is no longer if the cycle will end, but how the new one will be defined. As the ancient Old Testament year of Jubilee recognized thousands of years ago, debt cannot grow forever. Eventually, the ledger must be wiped clean, and history suggests that the more we resist the reset, the more violent the eventual clearing becomes. The pattern is fixed. The variables are moving. The supercycle has reached its inevitable conclusion. To understand where this leaves the individual, we must examine the mechanism of the great deleveraging. In every historical supercycle, there is a moment where the psychological illusion of wealth evaporates. When you look at your bank balance or your brokerage account, you are looking at a digital representation of someone else's promise to pay. In the early stages of a cycle, those promises are as good as gold. In the terminal stage, they become IOUs, backed by an empty vault. This is why we see the emergence of the hard asset migration. Throughout the 1970s, the midpoint of our current supercycle, and again in the late 1920s, smart money began a quiet exit from paper-based promises and into tangible claims: gold, productive land, energy infrastructure, and scarce commodities. This migration is the ultimate indicator of the hidden forces at work. While the public is encouraged to maintain faith in the traditional retirement accounts and currency-denominated assets, the institutional class, the sovereign wealth funds, and the primary dealers begin to pivot. We are currently witnessing central banks purchasing gold at the highest rates since the 1960s. This is not because they believe in barbarous relics, but because they are preparing for a world where the US dollar and other fiat currencies no longer serve as a reliable store of value. They are hedging against the very system they manage. This is the geopolitical money power play. Those who hold the hard assets during the reset get to write the rules for the next 100-year cycle. The final revelation of the debt supercycle is that it is a wealth transfer, not a wealth destruction. Total global wealth rarely disappears. It simply changes hands and forms. In the Weimar Republic, the wealth of the middle class was not destroyed. It was transferred to the state and to the industrialists who held hard assets and debt-financed machinery. In the 2008 crisis, the equity of millions of homeowners was transferred to institutional investors who bought the foreclosures for pennies on the dollar. The supercycle collapse is the largest version of this event. It is a massive margin call on the entire global economy. As we stand at this precipice, the historical parallels suggest that the window for voluntary adjustment has closed. The mathematical gravity of 320 trillion in debt is now pulling the global financial system toward its center. The choice for the citizen, the investor, and the nation is no longer how to save the old system, but how to survive the transition into the new one. The patterns are etched in the ruins of Rome, the ledgers of 18th century France, and the breadlines of the 1930s. Those who ignore the cycle are doomed to be its fuel. Those who recognize it are the only ones with a chance to navigate the coming storm. The debt supercycle has reached its inevitable end. The next chapter of history is already being written in the flows of gold, the shift of geopolitical alliances, and the quiet preparations of the global elite. The only remaining question is, what will you hold when the music finally stops? To navigate the final deleveraging, one must understand the shift from return on capital to return of capital. In the terminal stage of a debt supercycle, the primary objective of the global elite is no longer the accumulation of more currency, but the preservation of purchasing power through the great narrowing. This is a period where the gates of liquidity begin to close, and the various asset classes that flourished during the debt-fueled expansion, speculative tech, over-leveraged real estate, and unsecured corporate bonds, are systematically pruned from the global ledger. We see this today in the tightening of credit conditions and the increasing selectivity of the world's largest lenders. The system is becoming a lifeboat, and there isn't room for everyone's paper wealth. The historical precedent for this is the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference. As World War II drew to a close, the world's financial architects realized that the debt supercycle of the British Empire had physically and mathematically expired. They didn't just tweak interest rates, they wiped the slate clean and established a new global operating system. Today, equivalent is the push for sovereign debt restructuring frameworks and the quiet experimentation with unified ledgers by the Bank for International Settlements. These institutions are preparing for a day zero scenario where the old debt is denominated into a new, likely digital reserve unit. This is the ultimate elite strategy, ensuring that while the public's debts remain real, the institutional debt is reorganized out of existence through legislative fiat. We are currently observing the fracturing of the global reserve. For the first time since the end of the gold standard in 1971, the neutrality of money is being questioned. When the U.S. Treasury froze the reserves of a G20 nation in 2022, it signaled to every central bank in the world that the dollar system was no longer a purely economic tool, but a geopolitical weapon. This has accelerated the parallel financial system being built by the East. This is not just about trade, it is about creating a debt-free settlement layer, using gold, commodities, and localized currencies to bypass the collapsing Western supercycle. This transition period is historically the most volatile, as the incumbent power attempts to maintain its seigniorage, the right to print the world's money, while the rising powers seek to anchor the world in tangible value. The big truth of the debt supercycle is that it is a natural, albeit painful, corrective mechanism of human civilization. Just as a forest requires a fire to clear the deadwood and allow for new growth, an economy requires a deleveraging to clear the unpayable obligations that stifle innovation and productivity. The collapse is not the end of the story. It is the necessary precursor to the next springtime. However, for those living through the winter of the cycle, the experience is one of profound displacement. The patterns are clear. Those who rely on the promises of a bankrupt system are left behind, while those who align themselves with the physical realities of energy, food, and hard assets are the ones who build the next empire. The cycle is closing. The debt is peaking. The history is repeating. The only variable that remains is how much of the old world you're willing to let go of to survive the new one. In this final movement of the debt supercycle, we find ourselves in the Great Compression, the moment where the exponential growth of debt finally meets the finite limits of the physical world. History shows us that while the peak of the cycle is marked by a sense of invincibility, the transition into the next era is defined by a return to fundamental truths. The hidden mechanism that allowed the current system to survive for 8 decades, the ability to export inflation and borrow against a global reserve status, is no longer functioning as it once did. As the liquidity that lubricated the global economy begins to dry up, we are seeing the emergence of a two-tiered reality. One tier composed of paper claims that are being systematically devalued, and another composed of the actual levers of power, energy, arable land, strategic technology, and the gold reserves of sovereign states. The climax of the narrative is not a single explosion, but a series of phase shifts. We are moving from a world of abundant credit to one of scarcity and realism. In the 1930s, this shift took the form of the Dust Bowl and the collapse of international trade. In the 21st century, it is manifesting as the energy transition and the fracturing of the digital supply chain. The institutions that once seemed eternal, the dominant central banks, the global trade organizations, and the debt-backed welfare states, are being forced to choose between social stability and financial integrity. History suggests they will almost always choose the former by sacrificing the currency, leading to the final reset of the monetary unit itself. As we conclude this documentary, the impactful reflection we must carry forward is that the end of a supercycle is also the moment of greatest opportunity for those who are awake. Every major historical collapse has acted as a forge, creating a new set of winners who recognized the shift before the masses. The Roman elite, who moved their wealth into self-sufficient villas, survived the fall of the city. The merchants who pivoted to the Atlantic trade survived the decline of the Mediterranean powers. Today, the new pioneers are those who understand that the era of easy money was a historical anomaly, and that we are returning to a period where value must be earned, defended, and anchored in reality. The screen fades to black on the image of a modern city skyline mirrored against the ruins of a classical forum. The message is clear. The architecture of our world is not made of steel and glass, but of trust and credit. When that credit reaches its mathematical limit, the architecture must change. We are not merely witnessing the end of a financial cycle, we are witnessing the birth of a new historical epoch. The debt has been called, the ledger is closing, the cycle is complete.